This is Dr. S.J. Kala, an Associate Professor of English at Fatima College, Madurai. In this video, I'm going to deal with Terry Eagleton's Capitalism, Modernism and Postmodernism, the second part. In the first part, I had already dealt with the first and the second section. So in the second part of this video, I'm going to deal with the third section of the essay. That is, I'm going to deal with postmodernism and late capitalism. Postmodernism and late capitalism can be further divided into, for convenience sake, for understanding sake, divided into pastiche and irony, simulacra and the loss of meaning, relativism and the rejection of grand narratives, deconstruction and the critique of power, and the last one, celebration of surfaces and spectacle. So before I go into each of these parts, I thought I'll give you an intro to what it is. So in this essay, Eagleton moves from his analysis of modernism's resistance to commodification to an exploration of postmodernism, which he identifies as the cultural manifestation of late capitalism. And Eagleton draws on Ernest Mandel's theory of late capitalism, in which he talks about it as a stage in the development of capitalism, which is characterized by globalization, financialization, and the expansion of the media and culture industries. So postmodernism, according to Eagleton, is a reflection of this late capitalist phase, distinguished by its embrace of commodification, where you find that the traditional and cultural distinctions are blurred, and it focuses more on surface level aesthetics, which you don't find in modernism, because modernism focuses on depth. So postmodernism, unlike modernism, does not resist the commodifying logic of capitalism. Instead, it fully accepts it. And in the context of late capitalism, where you find markets being globalized and consumption being intensified, the postmodern culture represents the de-differentiation of high and low act. So postmodernism and late capitalism, we find that there were a kind of once clear boundaries between elite and popular culture, or avant-garde and mass culture. But that boundary seems to have been eroded, and by its erosion, it reflects the consumerist logic of capitalism. We find that the cultural products are no longer valued for their autonomy or their deep meanings. So as we saw in the previous video, they have lost their use value or their autonomous value for autonomy. Rather, the exchange value is what is really valued. So their deep meanings are lost. Instead, they are consumed as commodities like any other that are meant for instant gratification and disposal. So this de-differentiation is central to postmodernism's cultural forms. So in postmodernism art, literature and architecture, there is a blurring of genres and a mixing of styles, which we also saw in the previous video. And therefore there's no clear hierarchy between them, because earlier on there used to be a hierarchy in poetry. So Eagleton notes that the boundaries have been collapsed between what was traditionally considered high art and what was seen as popular or commercial culture. And it started mirroring the structure of late capitalist economies, where all the distinctions are flattened, mainly in the name of consumption. So let's move on to the next section or next subheading, that is pastiche and irony. So it's a key characteristic, pastiche is a key characteristic of postmodernism, and in its reliance on pastiche, postmodernists try to rely more on pastiche, that is imitation, or appropriation of multiple styles and genres. So there's no clear sense of historical or political context. And unlike parody, which carries, parody has a critique or a commentary, and there's a style also that it imitates. But in pastiche, you don't find any of these things, and it's just a neutral form of imitation. So it also, besides all these things, please note this one point: it lacks the critical edge. So whenever you engage in some kind of ideologies, earlier artistic movements such as modernism and others must have certainly dealt upon the critical edge. But in postmodernism, it was lost completely, and it started reflecting only the fragmentation and surface level aesthetics which were the hallmarks of the late capitalist culture. So Eagleton points out that irony is a defining feature of postmodernism, and postmodern works employ irony mainly to undermine traditional cultural hierarchies and meanings. So they started just enjoying and reveling in ambiguity and relativism. So this irony became a signal of detachment from political or moral commitments, and thus it started reflecting what Eagleton sees as postmodernism's political conservatism. So it even went one step ahead to refuse to take a firm stance. So in postmodern art and literature, you find that they don't take a firm stance. They started avoiding confronting the structural inequalities and injustices that were perpetuated by capitalism. So now, having looked at that, let's move on to analyze the simulacra and the loss of meaning. So Eagleton engages with Jean Baudrillard's concept of simulacra, and he uses that to describe postmodernism's obsession with representation and the collapse of meaning. In postmodern culture, simulacra are copies or representations that have no grounding in an original reality. So there's no reality at all. It evolved from somewhere up in the air. Okay? So Baudrillard argues that in late capitalist societies, reality itself is replaced by a world of simulacra. So there's no reality at all. And you find that representation refers continuously to one another rather than to any underlying truth or substance. So please note, another major loss is loss of truth. So for Eagleton, postmodernism's fixation on surfaces and endless reproduction mirrored this phenomenon, and we started getting to understand that cultural products are consumed for its aesthetic appeal or spectacle. Now, what do we mean by spectacle? These spectacles were devoid of deeper meaning or historical context. So in postmodernism, reality was something that is a hyper-real landscape where the distinction between reality and representation were always blurred, and the focus was more on image, style and representation rather than meaning itself. So it started reflecting the way late capitalism has commodified not only material goods but also ideas, identities and experience. It is quite painful to note that. So having looked at that, let's now move on to look at relativism and the rejection of grand narratives. So Eagleton's sharpest critics of postmodernism is he is of the view that postmodernists embrace relativism and that they reject grand narratives. So even this critic, Jean-Francois Lyotard, his concept of the postmodern condition, he talks about the traditional meta-narratives such as Marxism, Enlightenment rationality and religion, and how they are discarded mainly because they wanted to promote or project and pay attention to localized, fragmented stories. So in postmodernism, there is no overarching truth or universal framework. There's nothing like that through which you can interpret the world. Instead, all perspectives are seen equally valid, leading to a relativistic world view. So the rejection of grand narratives is itself a symptom of postmodernism's political disengagement. So by abandoning such grand narratives, what happens is it offers critiques of capitalisms and visions of social justice, such as Marxism's emphasis on class struggle or the Enlightenment's belief in progress. So postmodernists started retreating into cultural relativism. They left behind all of these things and they started moving towards cultural relativism. And they started abandoning grand narratives, which reflects that they did not take a conservative stance because that avoided confronting the systemic injustice of late capitalism. So in the absence of a unifying political or ethical framework, so there was no unifying political framework or ethical framework, and it was most often not seen in postmodernist works. So in the absence of all of these things, you find that postmodernism focused on individualism and identity, and that was always fragmented, depoliticized form of cultural expression. So that identity was a fragmented and depoliticized form of cultural expression. So having looked at that, we now shall look into deconstruction and the critique of power. So Eagleton links postmodernism's relativism to the influence of Jacques Derrida's theory of deconstruction, which seeks to destabilize fixed meanings. So there are no fixed meanings at all, and there are no hierarchies also in language and culture. So in deconstruction, there's no single stable meaning for any text or concept. Instead, meanings are constantly shifting. So it doesn't stop with shifting. They're constantly shifting and they're open to multiple interpretations. So modernism adopts this approach, and they started reveling as well as reveling I should say, in the fluidity of meaning, and they started rejecting to impose a fixed or coherent interpretation on cultural products. So deconstruction could be considered as a powerful tool for critiquing power structures that in postmodernism it often leads to a kind of a nihilism or political paralysis. So by destabilizing meaning, they started they started going for it without offering any alternative framework for understanding the world. So postmodernism can appear to celebrate what? The collapse of meaning rather than the challenge the structures of power that produce inequality and exploitation. So Michel Foucault's critiques of power structures which influenced postmodernist thought, it focused on how power operates in society and culture. But Eagleton suggests that postmodernism, in its focus on representation and fragmentation, often lost sight of these power dynamics, particularly the material power dynamics. So now, having discussed that, let's move on to the celebration of surfaces and spectacle. So Eagleton is very strong or very vehement in critiquing the postmodernists, that they celebrate surfaces over depth which was really appreciated by the modernists. So in postmodern culture, it is not the content or substance of a cultural product that matters, but its appearance, style and spectacle. So postmodernism in Eagleton's view revels in the play of surfaces and the aestheticization of life. So it started treating culture as a series of disconnected experiences, not connected or holistic experiences, but disconnected experiences that can be consumed rather than as a vehicle for meaning or political engagement. So this focus on surfaces is evident in many aspects, in many arenas, okay, like in postmodern architecture, film, fashion and advertising, where image and style are everything. So you find that postmodernism surface level aesthetics are a reflection of the commodified nature of culture under late capitalism. So in a consumer society, cultural products are designed to be instantly consumable and disposable, as I discussed in the previous video, and they appeal to the senses rather than the intellect. So you find that the spectacle of postmodern culture distracts from the deeper issues that most often art and literature dealt with, deeper issues of social inequality and exploitation. So thus it started turning political and ethical questions into just aesthetic choices. If you want, you can use them, otherwise you can leave them. And this, for Eagleton, is the ultimate form of political conservatism, as it encourages passive consumption rather than active critique. So now, having dealt with all of these things, let me move further to just sum them up. So Eagleton's analysis of postmodernism in his essay presents it as a cultural expression that reflects the fragmented, commodified nature of late capitalism. Postmodernism's reliance on pastiche, irony and simulacra mirror the disorienting effects of a globalized consumerist economy. So by rejecting grand narratives and by opting for relativism, postmodernism avoids confronting the structural inequality. So it doesn't go, like it's quite safe. It doesn't want to confront the structural inequalities or the injustices of capitalism. Actually, these were confronted by the modernists, but the postmodernists do not confront it. So they do not confront them, rather they focus only on the surface aesthetics and spectacle. So Eagleton says that he highlights upon the political retreat, that's to say, the more radical possibilities of modernism, which despite its flaws attempted to resist. So modernism was very, very clear. Even if it had its own flaws, it tried to resist commodification, which was the logic of capitalism. On the other hand, contrary to them, the postmodernists, they reflect and reinforce the cultural logic of late capitalism, and thus they turn culture into a commodity that could be consumed rather than a space for political or ethical engagement. So art and literature are devoid of political and ethical discourses. So it is just a commodity that has to be consumed. So thank you so much for your patient watching. Hope this video was useful to you.